She vanished into thin air, or so it seemed. On a warm August day in 2002, 32-year-old Michele Whitaker walked out of her life in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and simply didn't return. There was no grand farewell, no trail of breadcrumbs, no tear-stained note left behind. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. In the days that followed, her family began to worry. When she didn't call back, when her phone went silent, when her usual patterns suddenly unraveled, and the void she left behind grew eerily louder. The terrifying beauty of real-life mystery is that it doesn't ask for permission before it takes root. There was no crime scene, no flashing lights, no broken glass or overturned furniture. Just the silence of her absence and the slow-blooming panic that it brought with it. Everyone feared the worst, because the worst had become too common. At first, her disappearance didn't ignite the national spotlight. Michele wasn't famous. She didn't vanish from a high-rise penthouse or while filming a documentary. Her vanishing wasn't the sort that made headlines. It was quieter, murkier. The kind that law enforcement sometimes, unconsciously, underestimates. She was struggling with life. She had demons. She was drifting. To some, she may have just seemed like another woman who'd gotten lost along the way. But that was never the truth, was it? Behind the curtain of her struggles was a woman whose life had unraveled, but not disappeared. Her family knew that. Her mother never let go of the possibility, no, the conviction, that Michele was still alive. But the truth is far more complicated than hope. And in Michele's case, what lay beneath the surface wasn't just tragedy. It was reinvention, deception, and a complete rewriting of identity that no one could have predicted. For 6 years, the world assumed she was dead, or taken, or buried beneath a killer's secret. Leads went cold. Time passed. In 2005, the unthinkable happened. A serial killer was arrested in the same region where Michele had last been seen. His name was Todd Kohlhepp. His crimes were brutal. Women, murder, silence. And as investigators began peeling back the layers of his horrific legacy, whispers began to echo. Could Michele have been one of his early victims? The idea was horrifying and almost believable. The timelines could have matched. She had vanished with no explanation. Her face began appearing in connections to this killer. And just like that, Michele's name became more than a missing person. It became a potential case in a murderer's long shadow. The thought tore through her family like a storm. Every hope they had clung to began to waver under the possibility that Michele hadn't walked away. She'd been taken. But this story was never meant to follow expectations. In 2008, 6 years after her disappearance, an astonishing truth surfaced. A simple tip led authorities across the country to Oregon. There, in a quiet community, under an entirely different name and identity, Michele Whitaker was alive. Alive. And not only alive, but choosing to live as someone else. She hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been murdered. She had, for all intents and purposes, vanished on purpose. And suddenly, the narrative shattered into 1,000 refracted pieces. Because it's one thing to lose someone. It's another to realize they left willingly. What makes a woman abandon her family, her name, her past? What pushes someone so far that faking a disappearance becomes a form of salvation? And what do? What does anyone do when the person you mourned turns out to be breathing just fine, under a false name, in a different state, never reaching out? That's not the end of this story. It's not even the middle. Because to understand Michele Whitaker's disappearance is not to understand where she went. It's to ask why. It's to dig into what it means to flee your own life so completely that you let the world believe you're dead. And to then choose, day after day, not to go back. This isn't a story about a woman who got lost. It's a story about a woman who escaped. But from what? And at what cost? You think you've heard tales like this before, but you haven't. Michele Whitaker didn't vanish in a cinematic storm of chaos or bloodshed. There was no screeching of tires, no frantic 911 calls echoing through the night. What happened to her didn't follow the script of a classic missing person case. She disappeared in a way that almost seemed voluntary, as though she slipped through a crack in the world and quietly closed the door behind her. But that doesn't mean it was clean, or simple, or painless. Before she was a mystery, Michele was a woman at war with her own life. Friends described her as warm, but troubled. Family recalled moments of light in between long, hard shadows. She had brushes with addiction, a strained relationship with stability. There were moments when she tried to pull it all together, then moments when she spiraled right back out. Michele wasn't just lost to the world. She was lost to herself. And that might be the most terrifying kind of disappearance. When someone vanishes not from the outside, but from the inside first. In the weeks after she was last seen, no one knew what to make of it. Some assumed she'd taken off. Others feared she hadn't made it very far at all. And slowly, the spotlight dimmed. Police had little to go on. There was no body, no crime scene, no witness willing or able to offer a trail. She became another cold file in a drawer that gets opened less and less. Her name, one among thousands. Her photo, slowly yellowing. But behind that photo was a mother who refused to let her daughter become another statistic. From day one, Michele's mother, Jean Whitaker, kept pushing. She filed reports. She showed up. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. She never let it rest. Where some families retreat into grief, Jean marched into it like a battlefield. Because something didn't sit right. Even if Michele had left on her own. Where was she? Why hadn't she called? No arrests. No credit card usage. No trace. She had simply been swallowed whole. Until Todd Kohlhepp's name entered the frame. By the mid-2000s, a string of gruesome murders would finally lead to his arrest. A man with a deceptively clean record, hiding a mind twisted with darkness. Investigators began uncovering layers to his crimes, many of them years old. And that's when something clicked. People started connecting timelines, geographies, faces. One of them looked like Michele. For the first time in 6 years, her name was spoken again, loudly, publicly, and with urgency. Had she fallen victim to him? The idea was plausible, but chilling. And for her family, it was like dying a second time. What if the woman they'd always hoped was still out there had been murdered by a man who walked free for years? What if she was buried on one of his properties, her body forgotten, while her name became one more unsolved chapter in a serial killer's legacy? The media picked it up. Michele Whitaker was now not only missing, she was a possible victim. Suddenly, interest flared. Her photo reappeared. Questions reopened. Detectives began revisiting old leads, re-interviewing old acquaintances. It was the kind of attention that often comes too late. But fate, for once, had other plans. In Oregon, a woman living under an assumed name watched these headlines flicker past. A woman who, for years, had been living in obscurity, quietly blending into a life that wasn't really hers. And then, somehow, a tip surfaced. A trace. A name. A location. And the police came knocking. She didn't resist. She didn't run. Because she was Michele Whitaker. Alive. In Oregon. Choosing, every day, not to go back to her past. She had walked away from everything. Her family, her identity, her pain. And she hadn't looked back. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine the choice to let your own mother grieve for you for 6 long years. Not because you're cruel, but because you believe there's no way back that doesn't come with chains. Imagine the loneliness of building a life under a lie, and the sheer desperation that must have driven you to do it. Michele wasn't dead. She was in hiding. Not from a killer. Not from danger. From herself. And yet the question remains, What exactly happened during those missing years? Who was Michele Whitaker? Not just on paper, but inside those vanished hours, those forgotten days, those blank years no one can account for. What made her leave? And what was she chasing when she did? The answers aren't simple, but they exist. Somewhere between grief and reinvention, between survival and betrayal, they wait. And they're darker than anyone expected. Because the hardest part of this story isn't that Michele was missing. It's what was found when she finally came back into view. What do you say to someone who chose to become a ghost? By the time authorities confirmed Michele Whitaker was alive in Oregon, the world that had grieved her was left holding its breath, suspended between shock and a strange kind of anger. She wasn't abducted. She wasn't dead. She hadn't been buried in some backwoods nightmare or locked away by a serial killer. No, she had been alive. Renting homes, making friends, going by another name. And every day that passed, she had looked the truth in the eye and walked away from it. The woman her family mourned was living under sunlight while they drowned in shadow. And here's where the story stops being a clean-cut, happy ending. Because this isn't a movie. There's no violin swell, no slow-motion embrace at the airport, no credits rolling over tearful reunions. What followed her discovery was far more human. Raw, unforgiving, complicated beyond comprehension. When Michele was located, there was no grand explanation, no confession that untangled the past in neat narrative form. She didn't appear with answers. She appeared with distance, a self-made wall. She hadn't been hiding from danger. She'd been hiding from herself, from everything she couldn't fix, couldn't face, couldn't bear to carry anymore. People wanted clarity. What they got was a mirror to their assumptions. It wasn't just her family who'd been searching. Former friends, co-workers, police officers, even journalists who had long given up hope. They all had theories. Drugs, trauma, mental illness, abuse, debt. Was she running from someone? From something? Did someone hurt her so badly that disappearing seemed like survival? But the truth, when it finally cracked through, was colder. Michele Whitaker disappeared because she wanted to. Because the world she was living in had become too much. The weight, too heavy. Her identity, a skin she could no longer wear. And while others blamed fate or violence, she simply slipped away. Changed her name. Found a place far enough from the past where nobody knew her face, her history, her pain. And she rebuilt. Quietly. Imperfectly. Alone. The police didn't arrest her. There was no crime in walking away. No law against ghosting your entire existence. But the moral complexity of it? That's something else entirely. The emotional fallout of vanishing and leaving behind a shattered family doesn't get tidied up with a pat on the back and a "glad you're okay." It leaves scars. Deep ones. Michele's mother, Jean, had spent 6 years believing her daughter might be in a shallow grave. 6 years replaying last conversations, wondering what she missed, questioning her worth as a mother, pleading with the universe for a sign. 6 years of grief, bargaining, numbness, rage. And now, what? How do you process the idea that the person you lost never really left the world, just left you? Jean never stopped loving her daughter. But love in a story like this doesn't heal in the usual way. It's a splinter that never fully comes out. And for Michele, re-entering the world she abandoned wasn't a return. It was exposure. Like coming out of the fog only to realize the world you escaped still exists, still aches, still holds you accountable. The people she left behind weren't characters in a book she could just close. They had lived in her absence, cried, aged, waited, died inside. And she had to face them now. Not as a missing person, but as someone who chose to disappear. But the story doesn't just end at her reappearance. It fractures there. It opens up into dozens of questions no one wants to answer out loud. What happens to a woman who no longer wants her past? Can a new name really mean a new life? Did she deserve a clean slate while her family was drowning in questions and candlelight vigils? Can you disappear and still be the victim? And what about the others? The countless women who were taken, who were murdered, who never had the option of starting over in Oregon under a different name. Michelle's story, though rare, started to stir discomfort because it cut too close to the bone. She lived, but not in the way people wanted her to. And in some cruel twist, her survival reminded the world just how many others didn't get that choice. She hadn't been found in a body bag. She hadn't been hidden away in a serial killer's dungeon. She had been living a new chapter, while everyone else was still stuck rereading the prologue. And that is what made the ending so hard to digest. Because there was no justice, no courtroom, no closure. Just the complicated, painful, unforgettable reality that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones we understand the least. But the story still isn't done, because what came after was perhaps the strangest chapter of all. Not the disappearance, not the discovery, but the reckoning. The question of what you owe to the life you left behind. The silence that followed her reappearance was not peaceful. It was heavy, trembling, full of wounds that could never quite close. And what Michele did next, well, that's where the final part begins. Michele Whitaker was back in the world, technically. But returning from the dead is never clean. There's something almost surreal about coming home after letting people believe you were buried somewhere cold and forgotten. There's no map for that kind of return. No handbook for reintegrating into a life you chose to burn down. The world had reshaped itself around her absence. People had cried over her, prayed for her, built scars around her memory. And now, she was expected to walk back in and... what? Smile? Apologize? Explain? Except explanations weren't forthcoming. Michele didn't step in front of news cameras to offer a tell-all. She didn't sit down with daytime TV hosts or issue teary apologies to the public. There was no press conference, no curated social media page detailing her journey. In fact, after she was discovered, she did what she'd always done best. She vanished, again. Not physically this time, but emotionally. She withdrew. She refused interviews. She didn't embrace the narrative others were hungry to complete. Because the truth, for her, wasn't a story. It was still a wound. People wanted a why. They wanted something they could hold in their hands, something that would make sense of it all. But the truth was messier than that. The truth wasn't one single event. It was years of quiet erosion, of self-worth, of connection, of identity. Michele hadn't been running from a person. She had been running from herself. From the version of her life that she couldn't bear to live anymore. And when she found the courage, or the desperation, to leave it all behind, she committed to the erasure. She became someone else. She got a job. She blended in. She lived silently, hoping no one would ever knock on her door. But someone did. And now the past was inescapable. Her family wanted answers. Her mother, Jean, still filled with the weight of grief and the unhealed cracks of betrayal, wanted her daughter back. Not just in body, but in spirit. Michele's siblings, friends, even strangers who had once printed her face on posters and pleaded for her return. They all stared now, unsure of whether to be relieved or furious. And Michele? She didn't offer what they wanted. Because maybe she couldn't. Or maybe she believed they didn't deserve it after all. Maybe, in her mind, she was the one who'd been abandoned first. That's the hard part of this story. No one is innocent. There are no clear villains. No clean victims. Only people scraping together meaning from the ashes of pain. She hadn't committed a crime, but she had shattered lives. Not maliciously, perhaps, but definitively. And when you leave without a trace and never call, The people left behind are forced to write a version of your death in their minds. They grieve. They suffer. They imagine horrors. And when that turns out to be false, when the person they've been crying over turns out to be sipping coffee under a new name 2,000 miles away, that pain doesn't vanish. It mutates. And Michele? She had to carry all of it now. The guilt. The confusion. The pieces of her old self that she'd tried to bury along with her identity. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this story was never about resolution. Maybe it was about survival. Because at its core, Michele Whitaker's disappearance wasn't a crime story. It was a human one. A woman consumed by the weight of her own life made a devastating decision to erase herself in order to begin again. And though it wounded many, it also forced us to ask something uncomfortable. What would it take for you to leave everything you know behind? And more frighteningly, could you do it? This is where we're left, with a woman who lives, quietly, on the edge of her former self. With a family still learning how to forgive the living after grieving the dead. With a nation that wanted a neat ending, but got something far more real. Michele Whitaker was missing for 6 years. But what went missing long before that was her peace, her place, her sense of being whole. And while we can all argue about whether she did the right thing, the bigger question is why so many people, quietly, secretly, understand her choice more than they want to admit. Because sometimes, what disappears isn't a person. It's a part of yourself you can't bear to carry anymore. And that's a kind of disappearance nobody sees coming. If this story gripped you, if it made you question what it means to vanish, to survive, to rebuild, then stay with me. There are more stories like Michele's, more untold layers buried under headlines, more human mysteries that never make the front page. Subscribe for deeper dives into the truth behind the disappearances, the faces we forgot, and the lies we tell to keep going. What comes next will stay with you. You won't want to miss what's coming.